Call to the cloud. Okay, I'm recording now. And Bridget, just for informed consent purposes, is it cool with you that I'm recording, and do you feel like you understand what we're going to talk about?
Yep, that's fine. Thanks, Alan.
Great. Okay, so I'll start the proper thing now. Hi, everybody, and welcome along. I'm talking to Professor Bridget Anderson, who is a professor at Bristol University in the UK, where she directs an institute on mobilities. She's previously a professor at Oxford University, where we knew each other for many years and worked together at the Centre on Migration Policy and Society when I was a doctoral student. So welcome along, Bridget. Thanks so much for joining us. I'll launch into questions now. You've been a prolific and leading contributor for many years to the field of migration studies, but you've recently raised some fascinating, I think, and fundamental criticisms of what you characterize as the migration studies approach. And I want to learn all about the critique, and maybe the best place to start there is to try and understand what are the defining features, in your view, of the migration studies approach?
Well, I would say the defining features are that it's about migration. And the question of who is a migrant and what actually is migration have tended to be assumed. I think that means, firstly, there's a focus on the migrant as the kind of poor, the vulnerable, the oppressed, the low-waged. You know, we don't talk about expats, students, working holiday maker, visa holders. I mean, to be fair, I think that is a growing area within migration studies in the last few years, but I think it has until recently been kind of been seen as a bit niche. So I think that question about, you know, well, what is migration? Who is a migrant? How are we reproducing some of the assumptions around the political assumptions around the migrant? I think the ways in which, and this is related, that migration is not associated with other forms of mobility. Now, of course, as you and your students know, there is, you know, there was the mobilities turn in social science, and there is an interest in mobility studies, but I feel that, again, I think this is shifting, but it hasn't really been that joined up with migration, despite the kind of obvious connections. And I think what that means is that migration has been dissociated from other forms of mobility, and that's both other forms of mobility, meaning the mobility of most obviously, you know, goods trade, and the ways in which actually many migration agreements are actually embedded in trade agreements rather than immigration policy, but also, you know, the mobility of plants, insects, animals. And I think that it's a bit like having a kind of, you know, that old story about the elephant, where, you know, you have blind people feeling the elephant and you only feel the trunk, or you only feel, and I just feel like, you know, we've only been, when we're talking about migration, separated from these other forms of mobility, we're really only touching one part of the elephant. And given that migration is such a contentious topic, I think that doesn't necessarily help. We have to see it as interconnected with all of these other mobility processes. And I think finally, there is embedded in migration studies this assumption of international borders, and one of the consequences of that is that we don't associate migration and the ways in which we talk about it now and the policies associated with it with other forms of mobility controls. And I'm thinking more particularly of, you know, so I'm interested in my work with connecting immigration controls with the earlier forms, and more particularly the vagrancy and vagabond controls, because I think both are fundamentally concerned with the control of the mobility of the poor, however we understand that, whether that's, you know, whether that's the masterless men of the kind of 12th century England, or whether that's, you know, incoming people sort of trying to enter Europe from Africa. And I think actually making those connections with those forms of mobility controls really kind of helps open up then connections between the growth of both the ways in which actually central state authority was created, and kingly authority was imposed and created through. So in early England, you could only move from your village 100 if you had a document with the King's seal. So how did you get a document with the King's seal? You know, you had to have a representative of the King. So it's a way in which kingly authority kind of permeated rural areas. So I think there's something really interesting and important there about the ways in which mobility and migration is never simply about movement. It's also about relations of rule that I think migration studies kind of can often miss.
That's really fascinating. So, so if I can try and sum up, what you're characterizing as problematic about the migration studies approach is, we focus too much on the subaltern, like I say, the victim, the poor, the vulnerable, and so forth, and not on others who move. We focus too much on migration separately from other forms of mobility, like the mobility of things and the mobility of ideas and so forth. We don't historicize mobility enough, and we don't also look at how mobility and migration are constituted in a way by a particular social and political set of arrangements. So what we say in one place is migration might not be considered migration in another place. Have I kind of got that right, Bridget?
Nicely summed up, Alan. Thank you.
Well, I mean, speaking about that last part, I mean, a big one there is, China and the US for that matter. So much angst in Europe, of course, about migration and mobility, which crosses national borders within Europe, and elsewhere in the world. We worry about these cross-border movements. But when you look at a country the size of China or the USA, which is really a continent, movement of much greater differences is not considered migration. It's we're moving towns, or in the US, as they call it, transplanting. So yeah, there's so many things about that I can relate to. So as I understand it, with this critique, a key aspect of your argument is that these key problems with the migration studies approach is that it's leading to the framing of migration as some sort of problem that needs to be fixed. And I think it seems to me, I'd be interested to hear if you agree with this, that it also arguably leads to the opposite, framing of migration as potentially a kind of fix for any kind of problem, a panacea to all sorts of social and economic problems. And I think we've also seen that framing of migration, very recently. I mean, when we were both, you and I were both living in the UK, that was really the dominant global trope, that migration benefits everybody, win, win, win. This was the real discourse. Of course, the global financial crisis came along, the refugee crisis came along, COVID-19 has come along, and we're in a very different world now. It might be that migration is being framed as a problem. It's also this isolating of migration as a thing that allows it to be framed as a solution and a panacea as well. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, I think I agree, and I think what that shows. So I think so I suppose, just to sort of cut to the chase, in my question of, well, who counts as a migrant in public and policy debate, I think it is the person whose movement or whose presence, because we have to talk about race here as well, is a problem in some kind of way. And I think there were efforts, so in the UK, efforts by the new Labour government, but I think you're right. I think this was kind of part of a more general kind of effort shift to say that no, migration is win-win-win. And I've always thought it's really interesting how migration is something where you know, to kind of characterize political debates really overly crudely, where the right, for whom kind of class is not something really that, you know, and class inequality is really not talked about very much, to then suddenly it was like, oh no, you know, migration is a problem for the working class, you know, they're losing jobs, their wages are being eroded by migration. It's like, oh, that's interesting. That doesn't apply when you're talking about welfare benefit cuts, or, you know, so but then on the left, and as again, I'm putting this very crudely, it's like, oh no, migration is great for productivity and efficiency and all these terms that we don't usually apply in our arguments, but actually suddenly come to the fore in migration. And again, I think that should kind of raise a red flag with us and say, hey, there's something really interesting going on here about what migration does to these conversations and does to these different kind of positions. So no, so I think I agree. It's neither, and in a way, I think you're right that this is partly about connection and sort of taking migration out of everything, every context, and not seeing it as connected. And I think, you know, relatedly, it's also not acknowledging that migration is very often a symptom rather than, you know, it's not an independent variable. You know, it's often a symptom of other factors. So yeah, so you can try and control migration, but if actually the kind of causes are, you know, you don't do something about the causes, you're only ever dealing with the symptom, then you're never going to get anywhere.
Yeah. So also key to your critique is this, the idea that we need to get beyond methodological nationalism, which of course is a really important idea in our field. You know, it goes right back to Herminio Martins, I guess, in the 1970s, talking about methodological nationalism, and then a whole wave in the 1990s when transnationalism research became big for migration scholars. So, you know, help us to understand, particularly the graduate students who are going to be listening to this interview, what is methodological nationalism and why do you think it's a problem when we're studying migrants and migration?
Okay, so I'm changing my mind as I'm speaking to you. So I'm not changing my mind about what methodological nationalism is, which again, and this is really to summarize far more complicated arguments, you know, it's the assumption of the nation state as a kind of natural and inevitable container of social processes. And the fact is, you know, it is a container of social processes in that, you know, we might want to kind of critique the idea of, I don't know, a national labour market, but actually the labour market is nationally governed, and that matters. You know, if you've got, you know, it affects your, what is the minimum wage, what are your rights and protections, all of that is something that is nationally governed. So in that sense, you have a national labour market. And also it's the way that, but it's also the way in which people, ordinary people, including ourselves, understand accountability, political accountability, and how politics work. So methodological nationalism is basically saying, yes, this, you know, there is a problem with just assuming the nation state is this natural container, and using, for migration studies, then using policy categories as analytical categories. So I suppose that's the kind of fundamental problem with it, is the migrant is a policy category, yet we very often unthinkingly transpose it and use it as an analytical category. And I think kind of that gets to the issue of when you were asking about what my critique of migration studies is. I think maybe, and this was implicit, I think, in what I was saying, is that we don't recognise enough how borders and immigration controls and citizenship laws are actually productive. They're not regulating migrants and non-citizens, they are making non-migrants and citizens. And I think in not looking at the productive nature of those borders, we reproduce the idea that there is a stable national community of citizens that then gets disrupted by newcomers, and by certain kinds of newcomers. And I would slightly push back, I mean, or not push back, but I would take further what you were, you know, when you were just mentioning the US and you know, and China and internal movement, which I think is absolutely right. But I think it's also an issue for smaller states, including the UK. In that, firstly, you're getting increasing hostility towards people in the UK from different nations, you know, from Scotland, England, all that sort of stuff, but also people moving from other cities and towns. And I think that's been exacerbated actually by COVID, which has made us all far more aware of the internal administrative boundaries that actually were previously experienced by marginalized citizens, people on welfare benefits, people with, you know, people with criminal convictions, but actually have been exposed through COVID. Sorry, I'm now going beyond your question, but anyway, so I think, yes, I think the kind of productive nature of borders and bordering and internal boundaries is the thing that methodological nationalism kind of risks blinding us to.
Yeah, and this is a really, really fascinating topic and really central to I think the overarching ideas of this unit, you know, on governing migration, because, you know, it's really important to understand that the two words are somehow produce each other. The causality goes in both directions. The act of governing, of saying, okay, this is a border here. The place on this side of the border is different from the place on this side of the border. That act actually creates the migration in a way, is productive of it. And then, you know, of course, the fact of people crossing borders then creates a perceived need to govern in different ways, and these are mutually reinforcing. And in some periods, it seems that we get, you know, really tied up somehow, this self-reinforcing process, this, you know, vicious cycle in a way, builds up, and we become, we have very thick borders between all sorts of places, and, you know, it's like a real thick membrane through which anyone has to pass to go anywhere, and then there are periods when they just somehow seem to dissipate. And
depends who's trying to cross them as well.
This is right, yeah.
Is thin for other people. And just, I mean, just on that, I think one of the things that's interesting, if you're looking at internal borders, so I had a master's dissertation student, terribly, I can't remember her name now, but if you have notes, I'll send it to you, because I want to acknowledge her. Anyway, she did a really interesting piece of work, which was looking at social housing allocation policies in England. So this is governed by local government. And actually, when you look at the social housing policies, many of them talk about migrants and the problem of migration and what you do with migrants and how they need to be integrated. But by migrants, they mean anyone who crosses a local authority border. They don't just mean foreign citizens. So actually, you see all of the hostility that is focused on this term, this political term, migrant, actually then kind of spreads out onto people who are looking for social housing, who in some ways are part of those very populations which states with strong welfare states affect to be protecting through their immigration controls. So no, I think that's yeah, I think kind of unpacking the different, and that's an example, I suppose, of where thinking historically about the governance of the mobility of the poor helps us connect up, you know, gives us some kind of genealogy of, and helps us make those interconnections.
That's fascinating. So your suggestion in response to some of these issues is what you call methodological denationalism, which you define as an approach that quote, recognises that borders and citizenship are politically constituted and historically and economically embedded. Can you, we've sort of built up to this, but can you just walk us through this argument about methodological denationalism a bit more?
Yeah, well, so suppose firstly, recognising that the migrant, but then also, as I've intimated, the citizen is a constructed figure, and constructed by research as much as by policy. And thinking about, well, so starting our research, whether that's sort of secondary research or whether that's actually doing research projects, by thinking about, well, who counts as a migrant? And I would say, you know, broadly, you have three types of migrant. You have the migrant in data, you have the migrant in law and policy, which is a lot of what we've been talking about. And then you have the kind of migrant in social relations and in political debate. So you have these three kinds of migrants. They don't necessarily map on to each other. But actually, it matters if you are called a migrant in any of these domains. So just because the migrant is socially constructed doesn't mean that, oh, in that case, we'll just ignore it, you know, the answer. So I think firstly thinking about who counts as a migrant and why does it matter? And I think as part of that is also thinking about the citizen and nationalized subjectivities. So thinking about how we imagine ourselves and others and who belongs, and what Lisa Malky called the national order of things, and how that affects social relations and politics in a very everyday way as well. And that's where, you know, I think race really matters, particularly, and questions about the kind of you know, so-called second generation who might never have crossed a border in their lives. So thinking about nationalized subjectivities and how they work. And then thirdly, thinking about the work that the state does, you know, to create these to create not just thinking about the work that the state does, not just through immigration controls, but also through welfare benefits, through labour market regulations, through tax regulations, how actually the state, the nation state, is made up by much more than simply immigration controls, and how then immigration controls kind of interact with those. So I think seeing all of that almost as like a huge, I don't know, a huge laboratory or something to produce then the migrant and the citizen, and sort of investigating, well, what does that do for theory? What does that do for politics? And what does that do for our empirical research?
Fascinating. So it's kind of one of the points I think you're making is, you know, being a migrant doesn't stop at the border.
Yeah.
You know, you get into the country and you're constantly reconstituted and as a migrant, and your that definition of you, that identity, is reinforced through all these different mechanisms of government. So the governing of migration once you're in the country, and you might, you know, you might have passed the border at one point, or you might not have, but you're constituted by the state in all these complex ways as a migrant. That's fascinating. But
it's also, there's also a kind of historical component again, because I think historicizing this is important too. And I think it raises the question of who can claim what history. You know, so, you know, who can claim, and, you know, and that again, in a very, that sounds highfalutin, but, you know, in a very everyday way, who can claim to be Australian? Who can claim to be New Zealand, from New Zealand, you know, and why? And how does race actually fit with that? So I think, you know, which gets to the question of, we're not only talking about states, we're also talking about nations, and the ways that nations and states interact and or work together. So there's a really interesting piece by Radhika Mongia where she talks about and I think it's a very powerful argument, she talks about the ambiguity of nationality and how important that is, because nationality can mean citizenship, but it also has connotations of national, you know, belonging to the nation and national belonging. So you can be a citizen with all the right papers, but that doesn't necessarily mean you belong to the nation. And which is again where I think questions of race and migration kind of intersect. So yes, and I think then that gets to what history can you claim and why?
And you know, I remember us once many years ago at a conversation about, you know, how annoying it is to be asked the question, where are you really from? You know, when you know, the person in question might be born in the country where the question is being asked, and their parents might have been, but they come, you know, because of the way that they're read or perceived racially or ethnically, you know, they're sort of somehow their claim to belonging, to being from a place is undermined, and this, you know, this it's a very important point that, you know, it's not just the governing in the sense of the government that makes people, defines them as a migrant in some way. It's also discrimination. You know, if other people just, when they look at you, they just see migrant, you become that you become that
yeah,
person,
exactly,
that identity. And again, you know, as you pointed out, media, such an important part of that as well. The way that different groups of people, or the way that people are grouped by the media, sort of has an effect. It's that those people, you know, begin to self-identify in that way and group and try and find safety in numbers and solidarity in that, and that's reinforcing as well.
Yeah, and it's also related to, and you know, and I think you can also see that it's related to class. You know, so some people, in certain circumstances, people can be, as it were, released from race or whitened because of their class background. They might still not want to cross a park in the middle of the night because they'll be beaten up, you know, so you can't be completely shed. But so I think again, and that gets to the sort of point at the beginning, is also thinking about the migrant as not only racialized, but also as a classed figure.
Yeah, I mean, you often, as you said at the outset, you know, there's often sort of code like expat. Oh, that means wealthy, often white, migrant. But, you know, you'll find people referring to that kind of migrant as expats instead of migrants, and sometimes they'll even adopt that, you know, use of the word themselves. Oh no, I'm not a migrant. I'm an expat. To sort of
sometimes I think that's more. I think it's actually more common than not for people in that circumstance to call themselves expats. I've got I'm working with a fantastic postdoc who her PhD was actually looking at the racialization and the history of the expat migrant distinctions. Interesting.
Fascinating. I'm conscious of time. I've got one last fairly substantial question. I'm really fascinated by your suggestion that we need to migrantize the citizen to overcome some of these problems of sort of boxing people into the migrant category and all the problems associated with that. So what does this mean, migrantizing the citizen, and how exactly does it address some of the key critiques you've made?
Yeah, ugly word, migrantizing, but I haven't managed to get a better one yet. Sorry?
I'll let you know if I think of anything.
Yeah, let me know. Yeah, do a straw poll or something. So I suppose we've talked a little bit about that in terms of, you know, in a way, I think migrantizing the citizen, you know, the citizen is migrantized if they're Black or minority ethnic very often, because they are seen as a second or third generation migrant. So that's one form of migrantizing. And I think you can see how, you know, whether you shed or retain your migrancy is bound up with questions of race. I talked, and again, I mentioned, you know, how citizens can become migrants when they cross a local, if they're basically looking for social assistance, if they cross a local authority border. And kind of interestingly, when you look at the requirements that are placed on those citizens to be able to access social housing, they're remarkably similar to naturalisation requirements. You know, so the local authority can require them to make behavioural changes, to work, to volunteer. They have to be resident for a certain period of time, not have criminal convictions. You know, it's all like very, you know, very familiar actually to a scholar of migration and citizenship. But I think maybe migrantising the citizen is also about thinking that citizenship isn't that great. So I think there's something about migration studies and activism and legal work, which sets up what I call fantasy citizenship, which is like, oh, if you're a citizen, you have all these rights, and it's really, you know, you kind of enter nirvana, which, you know, actually, as anyone who is a citizen will know, no, I'm not in nirvana, actually. And I think this is shown, demonstrated very neatly in the UK, sorry to be kind of typically British and parochial, but there are these kind of so many rights now, like there's the right to work, the right to housing, the right to education, which are actually only made apparent because they're denied to migrants. So the right to rent doesn't mean that you have a right, you know, as a citizen, that you can, oh, I can rent an apartment, you know, I've got a right to be able to rent an apartment. A right to education doesn't mean like, oh, I've got a right to, you know, go to university. No. And I think, you know, and the right to work is the one that really bugs me, because the right to work for migrants is actually, for citizens, very often the duty to work. If you don't work, then you shouldn't get social assistance because you're too lazy and you know, you can't be bothered. So I think it's that kind of, almost that sort of dialectical approach between the migrant and the citizen that then kind of helps also citizens see that actually, you know, it's not necessarily, it brings citizens and migrants into the same frame to recognize, yes, they're differently positioned, but that, or they're not always differently positioned, sometimes they're differently positioned, but actually it's not necessarily a competition for the glorious privileges of membership. And maybe rather than trying to keep migrants out, citizens should actually be demanding more. Yeah, that's
that's really fascinating. I mean, I guess in a really simple way of sort of migrantising the citizen is to show that everybody has a migrant background in a way, and then that all people are just people in a way. So setting up this distinction between migrants and non-migrants, or migrants and citizens, is in a way an artificial distinction. Does that kind of capture what you're getting at with that?
Yeah, I don't know about everyone has a migrant background. I mean, yeah. Well, what do we mean by that? I don't know. I mean, but yeah, I think that sort of just recognizing that the distinction is an artificial one, and then, you know, the politics that kind of flow from that, I think, both flow from making the distinction, but also from trying to make the connections.
Fascinating stuff, Bridget. Thanks so much for spending time on this. Really appreciate it. I'm sure the students are going to find it fascinating, really educational, and it's been a real pleasure catching up.
Yeah, nice to see you, Alan.
Bye now.
Bye.
I will stop recording.